Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Laura Kovacs, and I'm honored to introduce our guests this evening. Curtis Sittenfeld's best-selling novels, including Prep, American Wife, and Sisterland, offer blueprints of the inner architecture of such diverse female protagonists as a wayward boarding school student, a former first lady, an identical twin with psychic abilities, and a modern retelling of Pride and Prejudice starring a magazine writer. Throughout the 10 stories in her new collection, she upends assumptions about class, relationships, and gender roles. An NPR review says that empathetic imagination is one of the defining features of Sittenfeld's fiction, along with the unfashionable valuing of workaday family relationships over glamour or romance, an unpretentious, deprecating wit that's never cruel, or at least never for long. She'll be joined in conversation this evening by Jennifer Weiner, #1 New York Times bestselling author of more than a dozen novels, contributing opinion writer for the New York Times Op-Ed and Sunday Review, and a Philadelphia treasure. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Curtis Sittenfeld and Jennifer Weiner to the Free Library.
So thank you all for coming tonight. I was telling Curtis the last person I was in conversation with was Hillary Clinton. So I'm slightly less nervous.
I know, I was actually telling people that too. I was the last person you were in conversation with was Hillary. I did mention that a few times.
But we were joking that I could just ask Curtis the exact same questions that I asked Hillary. So take us back to the night of November 8th.
I feel
how did you, that was actually the one question they told me not to ask, intriguingly, because they're like, she's so done with it. And how would you like it if every book tour, the conversation began with, take us back to the worst night of your life.
I feel like actually that was the worst night of my life.
It was the
too.
worst. Well, which segues beautifully into the first story of this collection, which is gender studies. So set it up for us.
I have to say one thing, which I feel like this is, first, thank you all. I'm going to pretend you're all here for me instead of for Jen. No, just kidding. I thank you. I actually lived in Philadelphia 10 years ago, and so weirdly haven't been back since. So I lived here for like 2 short years, and also Jen, thank you. It's such a delight. Like I got to have dinner with Jen. It's very one of because I was here for such a short time. I feel like I did not put down roots, but I came away with my friendship with Jen and have held on to it. And also thank you to the library, of course. There's so many. I came to events here that I still remember very fondly and clearly. Okay, so
gender studies. Yes.
So the premise of it takes place in 2015, August 2015. And a professor of gender studies from Wisconsin is in Kansas City, Missouri. She's never been in Missouri before, although she is, sort of a Midwesterner. And as she's going from the airport to the hotel, she has a shuttle driver who starts talking about politics and his fondness for Trump with her. And she's I think maybe, I don't even know if disagreeable is the right word, but she recently has essentially been dumped by her longtime partner. They never got married, but who has eloped with another woman. And so they end up, I feel like when I was little, and my parents would be like, what happened in that movie? And I would give like a 45-minute summary. So I feel like
You're doing fine.
I know.
You're doing fine.
Anyway, but
they're
they
in the
end
car,
up,
she's been dumped.
Yeah, she's been dumped. He's talking about Trump in this annoying way to her. And he makes some reference to like shrillery or something like that. Yeah. But then she
twist.
There's a twist. She thinks that she's lost her driver's license, and so she later, once she's in the hotel, she calls him and sort of says, and so then they reconnect.
In the bar.
For
starters.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. In part 2, yeah.
But I'm wondering, taking us back to that night of November 8th, like, because you wrote the story before the election, right?
Yeah.
But in the soup of it, right? Like while there were those,
Yeah, so I wrote it, I mean, it depends how you define the soup. I wrote it in like May, June 2016.
Okay, so, while this was all happening, but we all thought Hillary was going to
Yes,
win.
yes,
I mean,
yes.
because I'm wondering, do you feel that, this is a big question, but like, did the job of a novelist change on November 8th? Like, what's our mandate now? Like,
God, you should have asked me this like an hour ago so that I could. I think that's an excellent, excellent question that I don't know the answer to. I mean, because
does it feel different to you?
yeah, I mean, I'm
right?
sure it feels different to you. Yeah, it feels so. Well, because I mean, the thing I will say that sometimes there have been sort of national crises, and I feel like other writers will say like it just feels irrelevant to write fiction, and I think. Doesn't it always feel a little irrelevant to write fiction? I mean, like we're sitting in our, in a room making things up. Like, let's not pretend we're like. Usually, it's like, so in that way, it's almost I feel like pretentious to be like, oh, and now it's fiction has been so central to our national conversation, and now it's so peripheral. But I actually feel like I think there's two kind of questions I have for myself. Like sometimes I'll think. So I live in St. Louis, Missouri now, and we have one of our senators is Claire McCaskill, who's fantastic, and one of them is Roy Blunt, who's not fantastic. And sometimes I think, there are people who protest, I think like 2 mornings a week outside Roy Blunt's office. Like, would it be a better, and also, by the way, I live in Missouri, so I'm not assuming that all of you share my political views. One never assumes that after one moves to Missouri. But for me, I'm like, would my time be better spent instead of like sitting there making things up, would it be better spent like protesting outside Roy Blunt's office? And I don't know the answer to that. And then the other way that I can feel it affect me, I think as a reader and a writer, is I think that in what I read, I'm looking for writing that contains more of a sense of urgency and almost like, oh, this novel that, and it doesn't have to be timely or it doesn't have to be recently published, but it's like, if something's like, oh, this is like, I'd give this novel like a B or B plus, a part of me feels like, no, like I want something more and I want something, and simultaneously, I also feel so I think I'm more impatient and will maybe put novels down more quickly. But then when I do find a novel that I think captures my attention, I feel like actually I'm sort of enhancing my own mental health by reading it. So how would you answer the question that you just
Well, I mean, my response after the election was like, I have to write The Handmaid's Tale, only chiclety, I have to write The Handmaid's Tale with lots of jokes. But no, I felt like, seriously, like I was going to write a book about abortion and like what would happen in the world if abortion became illegal, because that felt very urgent and very necessary. And it turns out I'm not Margaret Atwood, like not even close. But, what I loved about gender studies was, it was very easy to sympathize with the gender studies professor. She's been dumped, and so your heart goes out to her. She's been hurt in this very callous way. But then the van driver, who sort of turns out to be like the more sympathetic of the two of them, I think. And I thought that was really like this beautiful moment where you understand somebody who you wouldn't want to talk to even necessarily, I actually had the experience of being on book tour during the election, and this one of my drivers was like a Trump guy and was explaining to me that he used to have a full-time job, but then Obamacare and his employer couldn't afford to give him health insurance, and so he's part-time now. And I was just like, please stop talking to me, like I can't. But with the story, I felt like you could with that guy.
Actually, by the way, last week, I had a driver who shared his political views with me sort of unbidden, and I did think to myself, I can't even make use of this in fiction because I already did. Like I already like there's nothing in this encounter that I can take away.
Oh God, isn't that the worst when like you can't use it, when you can't use the people who, come across you because they're going to recognize themselves no matter how cleverly you disguise them. All right. So tell us about like how these stories came, because like a lot of them were written in a very short amount of time. Mm-hmm. So like walk me through.
So I had, written stories growing up, and I went to graduate school in my 20s, and I think that sometimes people who write fiction think of short stories as almost like their apprenticeship, and then you write novels, which I think can be true and not true. But I always loved reading short stories, but once my first novel was published in 2005, we were talking about this too, like typically if you publish a book and you have sort of any degree of success with it, your publisher will be hopeful that the next book you publish will be at least like the same genre. So it's like if it's a memoir, probably another memoir. If it's a novel, probably another novel. And I was delighted to get additional novel contracts. Like I certainly was not, trying to turn them down. But it meant that I think that I sort of hit pause on story writing, and yet I would have these experiences or hear things or just have ideas and think, oh, that would be interesting, an interesting premise for a short story. And I'd written a couple, there are 10 stories in the collection, and I think that maybe 3 of them are from the past, although 2 of those I revised. And then when I wrote gender studies, what happened was my most recent novel was Eligible, and it came out in the spring of 2016. And after it was published, I went home, from traveling and talking to people. And I think, like, Jen, maybe you can say if you agree or disagree, but I feel like, being on book tour, and I don't go on like, some authors go to like 40 cities, like I usually go to maybe 8 cities or something like that, but it's definitely different from my regular life, and like I feel kind of worked up, and I've been online even more than usual, and so I just felt like I need to be writing fiction again, like for my own mental health, but it felt almost like daunting to go back to this novel that was a disaster, that was sort of in progress, and it felt daunting to like start a new novel. And so I thought like stories, and so basically, so I wrote gender studies, and then this is another long-winded answer, but the other thing that happened was I had tried off and on for literally 20 years to get a story in the New Yorker, and it worked. It finally worked. And so then that was gender studies. And so it was like shocking to me. Like this is totally sincere. I had thought like, I think I have it in me to win the cartoon caption contest, but I do not, I think I've been very lucky, and I just have to accept that I'll never get a story in the New Yorker. And then I got one, and I was like, this is so fun. I want to have another one. So then I just went on a story writing frenzy, and here you go.
And here we are.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, did they call you? Did they email you, the New Yorker? Like, what happened?
So actually, an editor sent me like a 2-line email. And I remember I was on a sort of shuttle outside Logan Airport in Boston. So I now feel like Logan Airport is sort of like
it's your
charmed.
magical place.
Yeah.
You're going back there tomorrow.
I know.
What will happen?
That's true. But it's the funny thing. I think that part of the reason it had this special meaning was, I have been very fortunate as a writer, like you have been very fortunate. I mean, I think we both work hard, but some of the good things that have happened to me as a writer are things that if I was a teenager, I didn't even know to wish for them. Like I didn't know to wish for foreign sales, or I didn't even really grasp what the bestseller list, but even in high school, I knew what the New Yorker was. I read those short stories. And so I got to, at the age of, it was actually like the week of my 40th birthday when this story came out, that I got to sort of experience my idea of what it was to be a writer, and it was really fun. I mean, it's like the editor that I've worked with is really smart there, and I think makes the stories better and saves me from myself, and so it's one of those things where, again, I'm not sure how much meaning it has to other people or whatever, but it was definitely like I think that I immediately, like within probably like 15 minutes of getting that email, I had like texted my siblings, like called my parents. Which
But
there's, yeah.
it's nice to have things that can still delight
Oh,
you
yeah,
like that.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Jesus, I've been trying to sell them a Talk of the Town piece forever about Wing Bowl, and like it's just not happening.
Well,
And
also,
every year it's the same note. It's like, this sounds interesting, thank you, but it's not for us. And I'm like, what do you mean it's not for you? It's people eating wings. How is it not for you, New Yorker?
Not only had I tried, I was also unsuccessful on the shouts and murmurs front.
I've tried.
I
that
know. Which
too.
one other thing I should
Hurtful.
say, in my frenzy of trying to get stories in the New Yorker, so I ended up getting 2 more in by way of submitting, I think 6. So I actually had
So where are the losers?
those 2 are between the covers of this book.
God.
You're
Okay,
not supposed to ask a follow-up.
Sorry.
They're in a drawer. They're in a dark
sorry.
drawer.
Well, because it's funny, because like I remember a regular couple that was in the
Yeah.
Atlantic.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you. So the story that gives it the book its title
Yes.
is actually the second story. It's called "The World Has Many Butterflies."
Right.
I feel like again, it's so hard in the age of social media because I have such indiscreet impulses but it's hard because I think this is okay. The editor said about that story, I can't believe it. He was like, this is like 2/3 of an excellent story. So I actually revised it. So I think now it's
right.
more like
7/8.
yeah, 5/6.
5/6.
Yeah, so I actually felt like even though even a few of them that didn't, and then the other thing I should say to is that my publisher, at some point, my publisher said, okay, we're willing to publish this book, and I was delighted because it wasn't like a foregone conclusion because they think of me as a novelist. And they then felt very strongly. They said, stop submitting your stories to the New Yorker.
Right.
Because they said, we want to be able to say, or we want it to be true that half the book is unpublished, so that because if it's all been published, then people won't want to buy it. And they, in fact, to be fair, they are in the business of selling books. So there's, I'm sure all those other stories would have gotten to the New Yorker if I.
I too. No, that's interesting though, because like I am somebody who will like buy a Stephen King collection and be like, I've read this, I've read that, and I get angry. And I feel cheated. And also when I pay $26 for a novel that's shorter than 200 pages, pet peeve. Don't like that. Okay, so you're gonna read a little bit from The World, which is that's where the title comes from, and it's a great title.
By the way, this is the story it's 2/3 of an excellent story, and I'm gonna be reading from the excellent part. So you're in luck.
You're too kind.
I know. Julie and Graham had known each other for 8 years before they ever played I'll Think It, You Say It. Then they played I'll Think It, You Say It for a year before Julie decided, realized, idiotically fabricated the belief that she was in love with Graham. Graham worked at the same investment banking firm in Houston as Julie's husband. Also, their respective kids all attended the same private school, which meant Julie and Keith saw Graham and his wife Gail regularly in a way that for almost a decade had barely registered with Julie. They showed up at the same soccer games and school fundraisers and Christmas parties and dinner parties. They greeted one another in a friendly fashion, and in retrospect, Julie went over it repeatedly, that innocent earlier era before she became obsessed. She thought of Graham as slightly more appealing than most men, but neither fascinating nor smolderingly handsome. Even later, Julie considered Graham and Keith comparably attractive if your thing was preppy middle-aged men, which hers apparently was. Should I keep going or should I stop? Is that enough? Wait, which one? Keep going. Okay, I'll go for like three more pairs. It was at Brett and Tracy Hutchinson's 20th anniversary party at River Oaks Country Club that Graham appeared beside Julie and said for the first time, I'll think it, you say it. Julie was standing alone momentarily because the babysitter had texted to ask if her youngest child was allowed to go to sleep with the light on in his room. Graham nodded his head once toward an unofficial receiving line that had formed around the party's hosts. Well, for starters, Julie said, I'm surprised they decided to throw this party because I was always under the impression Brett and Tracy kind of hate each other. She glanced at Graham before adding, I assume they're celebrating what, a total of 3 happy years together? Graham raised his eyebrows. I'd have estimated 1, but sure, let's round up. And even though they're both tedious, they're tedious in such distinctive ways, Julie said. With him, it's like all roads eventually lead to a disquisition on the pleasures of hunting white-tailed deer. But apart from being bloodthirsty, he's really gentle and has such good manners. Whereas with her, all roads lead to her gifted children, and she's so aggressive and braggy. Literally, she's probably told me 12 times that Mr. Vaughn said Fritz is the most talented math student he's ever had. Julie took a sip of her champagne before adding, to be fair, Tracy does look great tonight. Her Spanx must be killing her, but she looks great. It's so funny. Whenever, I've read this a few times, the laughter, if people laugh, is always female flavored. What are Spanx, Graham asked. Seriously, they're shapewear. Julie made air quotes. They smooth out your womanly lumps and bumps. And here I thought womanly lumps and bumps were one of life's great gifts, Graham said. Depending on the location. When Julie and Graham's eyes met, she said, who else? No, stop there.
So, not to give too much of this away, but these are people who are nasty. Well, no, because
I wish that that had been a blurb you had given to the book.
Well, I'm getting to the blurb part, okay? Because I was going through these stories and I was dividing them into categories, like the ones that are about prep school, the ones that are about marriage, the ones that are about people who were in prep school together and are now having unhappy marriages. And I was thinking about, and then I was reading reviews that talk about, you're the bard of suburban womanhood, which is, boy, talk about being damned with faint praise, right? But it occurred to me that your topic really is shame. Because I think that in many of these stories, there's a moment where a character misreads somebody, misunderstands something, and there's a line in Plausible Deniability where, and this shows up in a lot of the reviews too, where the main character who has been the subject of one of these misunderstandings thinks, oh, our private habits, our private selves, how full of feelings and essentially alone we are. And I'm wondering why those moments, what draws you to sort of those, those moments where people are just totally getting their signals crossed or just totally misreading a thing, as poor Julie discovers that she has been doing with Graham?
So that too is an excellent question. I think that I am very interested in the discrepancy between our public selves and our private selves, which feels in some ways more pronounced than ever before with social media. And I do, again, I'm not sure if this is good judgment to say this into a microphone, but obviously I'm about to say it. But I feel like if you videotaped or recorded somebody's life in the course of a week or something, or maybe 24 hours, potentially, it could be as scatological as a Farrelly Brothers movie, and it could be pornographic, and this would be an ordinary person. So it's there's all this stuff that I feel as if sometimes I also will this is sort of I feel like I sound like a 12-year-old who thinks she's really deep, but I'll think about human beings and the weird habits and who decided that a man wears a tie and that is formal. It feels so arbitrary, and there's all these customs, and it's almost we've all agreed to rein in our kind of animal selves. But I think that people, and again, it's some people are exactly the way they seem in public, and if you talk to them at a dinner party, if you talk to them in the office, that's how they would be, in other settings too. And then I think some people are very different, and I think partly what motivates me to write these stories is this curiosity of like, well, who's who and how can you tell? And I do think that like there is this, again, this discrepancy between, you know, our like almost like our Christmas card selves and our, you know, whatever.
I mean, the thing about Julie and Graham is that Julie says these terrible things. Like, she is somebody who will look at somebody and just be like, oh, she doesn't shut up about her gifted kids, and he kills things on the weekends. And there's this glimpse that we have of her with the man who becomes her husband, where they've gone to a party and she starts like breaking down his fraternity brothers, and he's like, please don't do that. What was the line? Like, it makes life less enjoyable?
Yeah, like something like, it's not that you're wrong, but it makes life
right,
less
to
enjoyable.
say these things.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I'm just like, well, clearly this man is not her soulmate. She should be with the mean guy, you know? And I think it's just like, I think my impulse as a writer would just be to have the two mean people like go off and like be snarky together for, like, they'd start TMZ or something like that. But you not so much.
That's an interesting, I mean, it is interesting to think about, like, yeah, without giving too much away, like, who should end up with whom, or, because it's also, it's been interesting to see people's reactions where I think there are a couple stories that in the most, if you were sort of summarizing them as succinctly as possible, you might say, you know, one person misunderstood the other. But I also think that they're open to interpretation, where it's like, or, you know, did someone else act in such a way that what the supposedly misunderstanding person thought is totally plausible, and then like the first person kind of backed away, or which is what in some ways the plausible deniability like term comes from. And someone even asked me on social media, like, so which is, you know, is there some real attraction between these people? And so I sent back that emoji that's like, like, I feel
God
like
bless that emoji.
I know,
like,
I
what
know,
would we do without the shrug emoji?
There's like a dark-haired woman shrug. Like, it's gotten so satisfyingly like niche-y in this.
I mean, it was interesting for me as somebody who's seen some of these stories in early iterations to see the way they've changed. In sort of small ways, like there was a character whose job initially, she was like a calligrapher, right? Like she had like made a fortune doing fancy stationery, and now in the book, she's a lawyer who defended a rapist. So
or an athlete charged with rape.
an alleged.
Yeah. We see where
we'll give him plausible deniability.
Yeah.
Tell me about the process. Like, how do you decide, you know, like that particular choice? Like, how did you decide? Because the premise of that story is this is a woman who's married to a man. She makes a lot more money, and they're in the same field. Like, he's a public, you know, what is he, a public defender or something?
Immigration
he's
law,
he's a do-gooder lawyer, and she's like a corporate shark. So, walk me through sort of building the characters.
So I feel like, for me, a lot of writing is intuitive, and then I have a rough draft, and then sometimes things will seem really wrong or like really misguided, and then sometimes they'll just seem like mildly wrong and misguided. But I think I wrote a draft of that where it was a woman, a very successful, because I wanted to write about this marriage where there is this, you know, huge gap in their incomes. So I actually interviewed a woman who is a very successful letterpress printer.
Right.
But I have to say, I think the most successful letterpress founder does not make what a corporate shark makes.
No.
So there was that like issue where she couldn't say, I make 20 times what my husband does. And then there was also, sometimes I'm sure that you've all had the experience of reading a book where the main character does something that's not writing but is artsy. So it's like they do pottery or whatever, and or like they play the flute, and it feels like a really close stand-in for being a writer. And I often find that distracting. Like, we were actually having this conversation. We were talking about two novels, Less by Andrew Sean Greer, which just won the Pulitzer Prize, and then the book, the novel Who is Rich by Matthew Clam. Those are both explicitly books about writers and have all these nitty-gritty, hilarious, authentic, details about the writing life. And I would rather, like, I don't like when I feel that there's some artsy stand-in for writing, and so I felt like that's almost what I was doing with that, or that it was that
with
it
the
felt
letterpress.
then it was like someone who defends a professional athlete who's been accused of rape. That does not feel like it's a stand-in for being a
but
writer.
the interesting thing to me though was it went from sort of a very neutral way to get rich. Like, you don't have strong opinions about somebody who does fancy letterpress, but you do have strong feelings about somebody who does what she does.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, so I think that, I often when I write, I think I'm trying to do the things that I like in other people's writing and not do the things that I don't like. And so I don't like when it's very clear to me in fiction whom I'm supposed to like and whom I'm supposed to dislike, and if one character is blameless and one character is very guilty. And so in some ways this character, and again we could do nothing but talk about likability for like 7 hours, and it would be fascinating to us. I don't know about to the rest of you, but the question of likability comes up often with fictional female characters. But I feel like that she's, in some ways, she is morally complicated, or she's vulnerable and she has some insecurities about her marriage, and then she also is like kind of this corporate shark, which one implies a certain level of competence, but two, I think, does raise questions about, and meanwhile her husband is sort of more of a do-gooder, but he's also more materialistic than she, and so it's I feel like I don't want to know, like someone in an interview recently from a magazine, I sort of revealed to the person who was asking me some question where I was saying, sometimes I feel like I'm having an argument with myself in two characters, and I think that actually that makes the argument more interesting, instead of if I just let everything I think be channeled into one person, and then the other person is like defenseless. And
No, but it was interesting because I thought that it added like a lot of layers and a lot of nuance to have this woman go from this sort of artsy, maybe a stand-in kind of job, to something that felt a lot more complicated, and with a lot more shades, because there's good and bad in both of them. I mean, like, oh, hi. Like this guy, who has this like lovely selfless job but won't make the bed, ever, because that's her job, even though she makes 20 times as much money as he does. Let's see, what else did I want to ask? You guys are going to get to ask questions too, but let's see. Do you have a favorite of all these stories?
I don't think so. I feel like there's some that didn't make the cut, and so I feel like it was almost like I had some unfavorites that I
Okay.
pushed out of the way. But I don't know. I think that I don't feel like you ever like curl up with pleasure with your own writing, and so unfortunately, and so
Was there one that came the most easily?
Well, I will say that on the one hand, like I feel excited to have a story collection, and in a way, like I'm sure people say to you, if someone says, I've never read one of your books, which should I start with? Or like, which is your favorite? And I feel like if I met someone tomorrow and they said, which of your books should I read? I would say, you should read my story collection, because almost like you could get a taste, and then you could see. So wait, I feel like I lost track of the question.
Was there one
which
that
one came the most easily?
Yeah.
So, but I will say, this is also probably overly revealing. At one point I was talking to one of my sisters, and I said, I feel in some ways like these stories came pouring out of me, like for the same reason that, another woman might like take Xanax or something. I've started writing short stories. So in a way, they all, like, they came out pretty quickly or pretty easily, but I also don't, it's not like because, whatever, like because I'm in my prime and I'm in this whatever, like magnificent sort of mental space.
Well, I think you found your métier. Am I saying that right?
I don't know.
METIE.
I accept it, so I don't know any different.
No,
yeah.
because I think, the highest praise that I could give a short story is when it ends, I don't want it to be over because I want to find out, like, okay, well, what happens?
Yeah.
Like, what happens to the woman who's sort of in email love with her brother-in-law who is in no way, shape, or form returning her affections, and the last story especially was, it's the people who knew each other in prep school and have now sort of gone on to, I think, in some ways, live the lives that people who knew them in high school would have expected them to live, and are now sort of like, right after the election, like evaluating everything. Like, I want to know where they go. So.
It's interesting because my editor said to me at one point, I think she felt like in the earlier version, a few of the stories were like tied up too neatly at the end. And she said something like, I think at the end of a story, you want to feel like another door is opening. And I had never heard, have you heard that advice?
No.
I thought it was really interesting.
Although I will say the New Yorker seems to me to favor a kind of ambiguity at the end.
Yeah.
Although, but that was the last question I wanted to ask, and it's not about a short story you wrote, it's about cat people.
Oh, cat person.
Cat person, sorry.
We are all
cat people, right?
Yeah.
But that story sort of, it became part of the conversation, I think, in a way I don't know that I've ever seen a short story do. If for those of you who haven't read it, it was a woman named Kristen Rupenian who has since gotten a huge book deal for a collection of short stories. But it's, a young woman sort of falls for a guy over text and then meets him in person and doesn't like him quite as well and ends up sleeping with him because that's sort of the path of least resistance and is sort of,
Spoiler alert.
Sorry. Well, I feel like everyone at this point, I don't know. But, I wonder, like, what did you think of that story? What did you think of how it ended? Like, why did that, like, capture people's imagination the way it did?
So, and Cat Person was published, I think it was published in December. So I feel like, probably like other people in this room, sometimes I read a New Yorker story right when it comes out. Sometimes I read it 2 years later. Like, it just depends on where the magazine falls in my house. And I read that one really quickly. Like, I probably read it, the day or the day after it came in the mail. And I thought it was great, and I just felt like there were a lot of things it did really well, and a lot of moments that were like funny and cringe-inducing and realistic, and then I'm definitely on Twitter, and I think I saw a few mentions of it, and I thought, oh, that's so funny that like
a New Yorker short story.
Yeah, a short story is being mentioned on Twitter. Like, that's unusual. And then it started to be like celebrities were tweeting. And then I swear to God, my Twitter feed was like 80% cat person. And I did feel, and again, I live in St. Louis, so it's like I'm not in the center of things. Oh, and so I'm one of 4 siblings. I swear to God, I think all 3 of my siblings said to me like, what's up with cat person? And they don't read unless I have a story in the New Yorker. They don't read it. So I think that, I do think that it kind of had these echoes with the sort of Me Too conversation. I think it had a really striking photo. Like, my sister is a photographer, and so it was basically an extreme close-up of a man and woman kissing, like a man with a beard kissing. And so now every time I see like a close-up of lips, I think like cat person.
Right.
So I think, the way I feel in general, like, I think that that's the only story I've ever read by that writer. I think it was a great story. I feel like in some ways I think it must be very complicated to have what happened to her happen, like, where it's like, I think she's, doesn't, like, it might have been her first published story or one of her first published stories.
Right.
And some people have said to me, like, are short stories having a moment? And I think maybe with our shrinking attention spans, maybe there are always stories being published, and there's like a huge, ardent short story reading community. But I, in general, in terms of like, this is the times we live in, that there's like, cat person, then cat person backlash, then backlash to the backlash. And I feel as if like the short version would be like, you know, the saying like, a rising tide lifts all boats, that if one short story gets a lot of attention, it's probably good for all stories. And but it is like a really interesting moment to think, and also, I mean, essentially it went viral. And,
Yes.
And there's questions about, like, I think anything that goes viral kind of like goes more viral. You know, it's like, why does, like, you know, the woman in the Star Wars mask laughing in her car,
right,
like,
the
why did that
Chewbacca
go
lady.
viral? Yeah, like,
Because that was hilarious.
really? But that's
right.
I don't know, but it is like, or I mean, again, I'm like anyone, like I like watch these videos, and sometimes I know why I'm watching them, sometimes I don't. But anyway.
This is like the biggest treat. You two are my favorite authors, and I saw you were
Oh,
coming to
thank
Philly. I like
you.
so serious. I'm like
Thanks.
dying right now. But no, so I wanted to ask you. So you weren't eligible before you did the short stories, and they seem so vastly different. And I wanted to know what inspired you to write that book. So there's been so many different iterations of Pride and Prejudice, remakes, movies, zombie Pride and Prejudice, and yours is so fresh. And so I was wondering what inspired you to write the book.
So this is a very big treat for me too. It's much more fun to be on stage with Jen than to be on stage by myself. So the short answer, which I have not started any sentence tonight by saying that, but the short answer is that these two British editors approached me and said, we're doing something we're calling the Austen Project. Would you like to tell a modern version of Pride and Prejudice? And so essentially it fell into my lap, and it was irresistible. Like, I just thought, if someone's gonna pay me to sit at my desk and think about Pride and Prejudice for 2 years, how can I say no? And I didn't, I didn't think that it was like I was being anointed as the successor to Jane Austen. I thought it was essentially like fan fiction and homage. But I think you're right that I feel like I was writing not completely in my real voice. I mean, I didn't. I thought originally, I'm not going to try to sound at all Austen-like, but I would often read a chapter of Pride and Prejudice before I wrote a chapter of Eligible, and I did feel like I'd use words like besmirch and vex, and like I couldn't help it, and so I was guided so externally in terms of plot, characters. They essentially, in most cases, they have the same name or variations on the same name. And I think that I swung really far in the other direction. And I also will say that, I mean, I did manage to offend Austen purists, but I didn't go nearly as far as my impulses told me to. And so I feel like this is why some of the stories in the collection are like I think I thought, you know, well, I don't care if you're an Austen purist with this one, you know, like, it's like, we're not trying to, whatever, like, wear an Empire waist dress and keep it all buttoned up right now. So
You actually posed for photos in an Empire waist dress. I'm sorry, I have to jump in with that, because wasn't that your idea for the jacket?
Yeah,
photo?
I wanted my author photo to me, and I rented this dress from a place in Indiana, and it like
Rent the
smelled
runway?
a little weird. No, not. It was like a bonnet, and my sister took my picture, and then I like sent, and my sister, who is a photographer, but then I sent the pictures to Random House really excitedly, and they said, like, they were kind of like, and I love my publisher, I've been with them for my whole career, and they were sort of like these are so dynamic and fun, and we know we'll be able to make use of them somehow, but we think we're not going to use them on the book itself. So, but they were, I mean,
You can always get a very graciously worded turn down from your publisher, you know, like when words are their tools.
No, I mean, again, I think they felt like there were some people who would just like look at the picture and be like, what's wrong with that woman? Instead of like, because I was like, it's so fun. And anyway.
Okay, so the author photo that wasn't.
Yes.
We miss it still.
Well, I had it as my Twitter avatar for like maybe 2 years. And then after Trump was elected, I feel like I was like doing like resistance tweets in my like Empire waist dress and
your bonnet.
And there was something a little ridiculous. And then I finally, my sister took another, like, I mean, in a way I should just use that author photo forever, but my sister did take another one for this book.
Hi, so I feel a little sheepish about this question. I'm gonna sit down for it, but I find the sex scenes in your work to be very compelling. I don't mean that like euphemistically. They're compelling in like their various settings. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Talk about like why is sex important in the plot and in your character development? Like, how do you write an interesting sex scene?
She puts her bonnet on.
I know. So, actually, I wish there's this line from an article that I wish I could remember, because so I have wondered to myself, because like the other thing, and I do have a cousin in the audience, but I would say I feel like I am kind of a prude. Like I'm kind of not a prude, but I am kind of a prude too. So it's not like, oh, I just feel like I'm so comfortable with it all, and we should all talk about it. I think that I feel whatever like sort of contradictory impulses, and so I do have the capacity to be embarrassed about scenes that I've like written, edited, gone through with and actually this is an example. So the New Yorker now does this thing where the fiction each week is read for a podcast by the writer, and then people can listen to it. And so I went to the public radio station in St. Louis to record gender studies. And I was like, and there's this man who's probably, I'm 42, he's probably a few years older than I am. I think we had met before. The sound engineer. We made chit chat about our children and school starting. And then we get to a certain part in the story, and I started laughing so hard he had to leave the room. It would be I would start laughing, and then I'd pull myself together, and then I'd read 3 more words, and then I would start laughing. And it took probably 25 minutes longer than it. And so he was just and then I went to record other stories, and he's like, I'll be down the hall, and if you need me. Anyway, all that is to say that I'm not it's kind of hard to answer that. But I was then reading an article one time pretty soon after the Lena Dunham show Girls came out. And it was essentially saying, well, why is there so much sex in Girls? And it was kind of saying something like, if you're interested in the psychology of the characters, of course you show that, because it's it's a very vulnerable and intimate state, and it's those are certainly as a writer, I'm very interested in vulnerability and intimacy, and so it's it feels almost like it would be a lost opportunity in writing to not do it, or to not go in that direction. But there, like everything, there's pros and cons, and so.
I once wrote a short story where it was a woman who remembered her ex-boyfriend's login, and he was engaged to be married. So she went on his wedding registry and registered him for a Hitachi magic wand. And I was very amused by myself. So I send the story to my editor, and I get back, it comes back with the note, what is a Hitachi magic wand? And I'm like, oh, well, she went to Catholic school. She's not gonna know. My agent will get it. And I send it to my agent, it comes back with the same note, what is a Hitachi magic wand? And at which
so
point
what
I
is a
know,
Hitachi? Just
it's something you don't want on your wedding registry. I was just I'm such a pervert. Why do I know this and they don't? And
from reading.
Yeah. Right, of course. But I don't know if you've ever done this or had the impulse to do it, but done a redacted version to send your family, where you just cross out.
I literally have you done that?
Yeah,
So
I don't read pages 300.
Yeah, I have done with my parents. I have done that, but I think that maybe as I get older and sort of more disorganized, I picked for this one, I just didn't go to the effort or something, and so, but I will do it. And it's, obviously I'm lucky that my parents, are interested in reading my books, but I do still send it to them when it's maybe 2 days before publication, so that they can't weigh in and be like, I think you should change. Yeah,
right.
yeah.
The neighbors will know.
Yeah. But my mom, actually, interestingly, my parents, my dad said he enjoyed it the most of any book since prep. So he does not care for Sisterland, and he thinks American Wife is too long, but he likes the stories. And then my mom told one of my sisters, she said, I think Curtis has found her voice. So if you want some unbiased endorsements of my
It's so
story.
funny. It's like, aren't they just supposed to like love and support us unconditionally? And my mom is like, your novels are fine, but I really like your op-eds. I'm like, Fran!
That's actually, my dad says the exact, he says, I much prefer your nonfiction.
It's like, what is that?
Yeah. Well, it's also like, to be fair, like I've sometimes said to my parents, I don't think that my parents, either of them, would ever read any of my books if they weren't by me. So if it's like, if they'd been written by someone who's demographically similar to me, but not their blood relative, they wouldn't. So I actually don't think that they should be expected to like them that much.
But they're your parents. They have to at least say they liked it, I think, in my opinion.
I really loved American Wife. And do you think about other first ladies?
Ooh, what an interesting question. So was the question, like, would I write a book about it? Well, so I actually am writing a book, and this is the premise of it. So, which I see this more as, it is technically about another first lady, but I see it as more about being about a presidential nominee. So the premise, I'm writing a Hillary Clinton novel, to my own surprise, and maybe more to my surprise than to anyone else's. And the premise is, what if Hillary Clinton had attended Yale Law School, as she did, met and fallen in love with Bill Clinton, and then in real life, Bill proposed marriage several times and she said no. And so the premise of my novel is, what if she ultimately had said no and then they'd gone in different directions? So that's what I'm working on now. It's going a little more slowly than I had anticipated, but it's because I feel like I deserve an honorary law degree from Yale because I spent so much time like Googling the library or being like, a constitutional law class in 1971. Like, is this what the professor would say? And so it's interesting, but it's a little bit slow.
Do you find that she was harder to get into than Laura Bush? Different?
I think that there is something where, like, I wonder if you feel this too, that I think to be a fiction writer, I think you have to feel like you can relatively easily put yourself in someone else's shoes. Mm-hmm. And so I almost think that there's probably a danger of me being too presumptuous and being like, no, it's very easy to write from Hillary's perspective. But she is, we were even talking about this, 'cause obviously you know her and I don't, but like when people say that she's unknowable, I feel like I understand what they mean, but I also think that she's always been so kind of constrained or constricted in how she can behave without offending somebody that, I don't know, I don't think I would ever, like, so a lot of people, because of American Wife, have said to me, would you write a Melania novel? And the answer is 100% no. Mm-hmm. And it's partly, this is really true, that I wouldn't want to I don't want to voluntarily spend more time thinking about the Trump administration, really. And especially a Melania novel is a novel where you're supposed to think about being married to Donald Trump. I mean, it's like, can you imagine choosing, if you could write about any subject in the world, like it's like, so I don't think I could write a novel where I didn't feel some kinship, and I do feel, again, I know this is like, I make myself sound a little bit like bananas, but I do feel like some kinship with Hillary Clinton. I feel like we made eye contact through the TV. No, just kidding.
But when I did these events with her, like, I would step on stage just to introduce her, and I've never heard applause that thunderous.
Until tonight.
Until tonight, right. But, people see themselves in her so much. Whichever iteration of her they're thinking of, whether it's, her as first lady or her as presidential candidate or her as wronged wife, like, people put themselves in her. And I think it's going to be so interesting to read a novel about, because she's had to contain multitudes in the life that she's chosen. So I can't wait to read, like, a different life where she's been less constrained,
Yeah, no, it is. I feel as if I don't think I would never write a straight ahead novel about the 2016. Election would be so, it would be so painful.
Right.
Anyway, I mean, not that we're Democrats. No.
It's Lee is the main character.
Yeah.
Is that right? She has a friend or a roommate who has the quality of never blaming the other person. And she always just takes responsibility for any conflict. You know what I'm talking about?
Her roommate, Martha?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
And I just wonder how you got the idea for that character, or if you can tell us a little more about her, because I just find her like one of the most intriguing characters in literature, because it's a quality that just, everybody would love to have that quality. Wouldn't it be cool to, to be like her?
That's a good, interesting question. I'm not sure if I have a satisfying answer. I mean, I think that, like, in terms, I feel when I'm writing a novel or a short story that I feel a lot of times like I'm like a bird building a nest, and that I'll take anything from it's like I'll take garbage, or I'll take like hay or whatever, like whatever serves my purposes. And also, I think that I'll sort of, like people will often think that if anything is autobiographical, the autobiographical part is likely to be the main character as a stand-in for the writer. But I also feel like, sometimes some very peripheral character can have an experience that I had, or my sister had, or, a friend of a friend or something. So it's hard to say exactly where Martha came from, but I will say that I like her, and I'm glad that you do too. And I will say I'm going to my 25th boarding school reunion in about a month, so stay tuned. No, it's funny when you say, like, there are two sort of boarding school adjacent stories in here, and it's like, I feel like it's almost like I wrote them in spite of myself. Like, I'm kind of like, still, Curtis, like, you're 25 years out. Like, can it really be of that much interest to you? But you can't fight your preoccupations.
Well, I mean, I remember I once got this like devastating line in a review that was like, Jennifer Weiner has clearly not gotten over high school. And I'm like, does anyone? Does anyone?
Well, I think some people do, but I wouldn't want to be friends with
See?
them. Yeah, like they would be
Right?
so
Of course
boring to
not.
talk
So
to.
boring.
I read this Paris Review piece that was talking about your work in terms of the sort of radically unambiguous, and you all were talking about ambiguity and sort of this preference in literary world for an ambiguous, like, fade to black ending. And I was wondering if a kind of reaction to that or disambiguity is something that you're like purposefully cultivating, or were you like, what are they talking about? What does this mean? Yeah.
Well, so I feel like when I write, I actually, and even, so when Gender Studies was published, some people said to me, oh, that's such an interesting political allegory. And I was a little, I mean, I know what they're saying, but I was kind of like, I wrote a story about a woman who lost her driver's license. Like I actually think of things in really concrete terms when I'm writing, and I think about like moving my character, through a room or from one scene to the next scene, and I feel like I would never try to inject, like I would never consciously, although I think certainly, subconsciously, I would never inject political commentary, or I would not be like, this is where I'm going to make a observation about class or gender or something. It's more like, I think that I try to be very true to real life, and so all that stuff bubbles up, because it's like class is often present when two people are interacting, whether, I mean, they're not speaking of it, but it's kind of implied, or humor or sadness is often just under the surface of people interacting. So I actually think of things very sort of simplistically, like almost the way I think of the schedule of my life. Like it's like, well, and so there was this essay that ran, I think, on the website of the Paris Review, sort of analyzing my fiction, and I like read some of it, and it was, I mean, I was like almost touched, and in all honesty, I mean, apropos of the whole gender thing, I was kind of like, oh, like now that I've written 6 books, I get to be I get to be worthy of an essay like this or something, where I don't think someone, like I've always, there's been this sort of push-pull of people thinking like, well, maybe you're a very commercial writer, which is not necessarily, I mean, like if you gave me my choice of like commercial or respected, like there's some advantages to commercial, but I feel like I didn't read the essay super thoroughly. I was flattered, but I almost felt like it would be like someone like writing an essay about the way I walk, and then I would like every time I walk, I would feel super self-conscious and, you know, not like maybe I'll read it in 6 months or something like that when the stories are kind of behind me. Was it interesting? Should I read? Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting. I think, it speaks to what you all were talking about in terms of why did you prize like a really ambiguous ending, like
Yeah.
gain from leaving stuff out, and they were saying like your work does what that does, but without leaving stuff out.
Well, I do sometimes feel as if someone says, you know, what's your work like, that I would be much more likely to talk about what themes or subjects are in my work instead of, I feel as if I am like the least credible. Like it's almost if I said to any of you, what's your personality like? And you're like, I'm really patient and I'm really, like it's sort of like what you say about yourself. I mean, you're probably half right, but you don't have that much credibility because you don't really have any perspective. Are we?
Yes, I think, all right, thank you all
Thank
very,
you.
very much.
And thank
Yes.
you, Jen.